Imagine trying to fall asleep 40 feet up, wedged into the fork of a tree branch, wind moving the whole world side to side, and somewhere below you in the dark, something large is moving through the undergrowth. And the only thing keeping you from a fatal drop is muscle memory and a grip you've had since birth. And here's the thing, this wasn't a nightmare. This was Tuesday for millions of years, for every single one of your ancestors, going back further than you can comfortably imagine. And then one day, somewhere in that impossibly long stretch of time, they stopped, they climbed down, and they never fully went back up. And the question nobody really asks is, why would anything give up the safest place on Earth to sleep on the ground next to the things that wanted to eat it? Let's start with why trees were ever the answer in the first place. Because it wasn't comfort. Tree branches are not comfortable. Ask anyone who's tried camping in a hammock during a storm. Trees were the answer. Because of one brutally simple fact. Most of the animals that could kill you in ancient Africa could not climb. Or could not climb well, or could not climb into the specific thin, wobbly branches near the top that would collapse under anything heavier than you. So for early hominins, height wasn't luxury, height was survival. A lion is a nightmare on the ground and a non-issue 30 feet up, and that math alone kept our ancestors sleeping in trees for an almost unimaginable stretch of evolutionary time. We actually have direct evidence of this, and it's not speculation. Researchers studying the famous fossil Lucy, an Australopithecus afarensis who lived roughly 3.2 million years ago, found that her shoulder joints, her curved fingers, and her upper body proportions were still clearly built for climbing, even though her hips and legs show she could also walk upright on the ground, which tells us something fascinating. Our ancestors weren't purely tree dwellers or purely ground dwellers. For an enormous stretch of time, they were both, walking during the day and climbing back up every single night like clockwork because the ground after dark was a death sentence. And everyone knew it. So if trees were this reliable, this safe, this proven, what actually changed? And the honest answer involves several things happening at once, not one single dramatic moment. And the first piece is the land itself, because starting around 3 million years ago, large parts of East Africa began drying out. Dense forests thinned into open grassland and scattered woodland. And this wasn't a small shift, it fundamentally changed the available architecture. Fewer continuous forest canopies meant fewer tall, connected trees to retreat into, and populations that depended on trees for nightly safety suddenly had a lot more empty, exposed ground between one patch of trees and the next. At the same time, something was happening inside these creatures that made the ground a little less terrifying than it used to be. Bipedalism, the ability to walk upright on two legs, was becoming more efficient and more permanent. And here's what's counterintuitive about this. Walking upright is actually a terrible climbing adaptation. The very changes that made walking long distances efficient, straighter hips, an arched foot, a big non-opposable toe, made gripping a branch with your feet significantly harder, so evolution was quietly running two systems against each other. Better legs for the ground meant worse hands and feet for the trees, and at some point, the version of the body that walked well started out competing the version that climbed well, not because climbing stopped mattering, but because the world was giving fewer and fewer reasons to prioritize it. Then there's fire. And this is where the story gets genuinely dramatic, because the ability to control fire is one of the single biggest game changers in the entire history of our lineage. And evidence from sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa suggests controlled fire use going back roughly 1 million years. And once a group could reliably keep a fire burning through the night, the entire risk calculation for sleeping on the ground flipped. A large predator that would casually stroll up to a sleeping, unprotected group in the dark will generally not walk into flame. Fire didn't just provide warmth, it provided something trees had been providing for millions of years for free, a barrier between you and the things that wanted to kill you while you slept. Except, now that barrier could move with you, be built anywhere, and didn't require finding the right tree in the right place before the sun went down. And once fire enters the picture, something else becomes possible that never really worked in the trees. And that's a proper group. You cannot have 30 people sleeping safely spread across the branches of nearby trees. Branches only hold so much weight, and trees only grow so close together. But you absolutely can have 30 people sleeping in a tight circle around a shared fire, which means the ground, once considered fatally exposed, suddenly offered something trees never could: Safety in numbers at a scale that actually mattered. More eyes watching the darkness, more ears listening for movement, and a fire that needed constant tending anyway, which meant someone was always half awake regardless. This is genuinely important because it flips the entire assumption people usually make that our ancestors came down from the trees because they got braver or smarter or somehow stopped being afraid. And that's not really what happened. The fear never went away. What changed is that the ground stopped being the more dangerous option. Fire plus a large cooperative group plus a shrinking forest canopy meant that by a certain point in our evolutionary story, staying up in a tree alone was actually the riskier choice. Isolated, exposed if the branch cracked, and cut off from the collective defense a group on the ground could offer. There's also a physical cost to tree sleeping that rarely gets mentioned, and it's simple. Exhaustion, gripping a branch all night, even instinctively, even in your sleep, requires a baseline level of muscular tension that ground sleeping does not. Researchers studying modern great apes who still build nightly tree nests have noted that this kind of sleep, while safer from predators, is measurably less restful than sleeping on a flat, stable surface. So the moment the ground became defensible, it also became, for the first time in millions of years, the objectively better place to actually recover overnight. Better sleep meant sharper thinking the next day, more energy for hunting, gathering, and eventually the kind of complex social behavior that trees, frankly, never had room for. None of this happened overnight, and it wasn't universal. Different hominin populations almost certainly made this transition at different times, in different places, depending on local predator density, forest coverage, and how reliably they could maintain fire. There's even evidence that some later still primitive human relatives, potentially including populations related to Homo naledi, may have continued using elevated or cave refuges long after other groups had fully committed to ground-level fire circles. Evolution rarely closes a door completely, it just slowly stops using it. So why did ancient humans stop living in trees? Not because the ground became safe in any absolute sense. The ground is still where the vast majority of predators live, still where you're most exposed, still the same dangerous open space it always was. What changed is that our ancestors built something the trees never could: a portable, shareable, endlessly renewable form of safety made of flame and each other, and once that existed, the treetops that had kept our entire lineage alive for millions of years quietly became optional, then rare. Then, eventually, just something we did for fun on a Saturday with a rope ladder and a nostalgia we can't quite explain. You will probably never sleep in a tree tonight, but somewhere in your nervous system, in the part of you that still tenses up slightly at total darkness, that still feels safer with a locked door and a light left on somewhere in the house, your ancestors are still awake, still listening, still doing the exact same job they did for millions of years before the first fire ever kept the night at bay.